I think it's recorded.
I'll be very brief. So it's my great pleasure to introduce to you Andrea Staiti. When we started this project, we were like thinking, who works in this area, who does sort of neo-Kantian philosophy and so on, and we had a hard time coming up with a list of names. I was first attracted to Andrea's book because I was working on Hegel and issues around nature and the relationship between nature and spirit, and his excellent book Husserl's Transcendental Phenomenology, Nature, Spirit and Life caught my attention for those reasons. But then when I actually picked it up, realized that most of it spends its time talking about Windelband and Rickert and all these philosophers that we were keen to explore in our project. And so I thought it was an obvious fit, and as you'll see, my own presentation on Saturday is basically trying to rehash some things that Andrea talks about in his book. Andrea was until recently an associate professor at Boston College. He's just moved to the University of Padua in Italy. Parma, sorry. Yeah. My mistake. And yeah, he'll be talking to us on Husserl's Anti-Naturalistic and Anti-Metaphysical account of action. Thank you, Andrea.
Thank you. So, first of all, thank you, and I want really to thank Giuseppina, Paul, and Alexis, for this invitation. Indeed, it's not easy to find an audience and to find, a group of people who are, let's say, congenial and who are interested in this kind of non-mainstream way of thinking about philosophy and the relationship between nature, mind, and philosophical thinking. So it's great to be in a venue that is clearly interested and kind of productively engaged in that kind of project. So the paper I'm presenting today, since this is a summer school and not just a conference, I thought I want to present something relatively short. So I don't want to use all of my time just to talk, because I'm really interested in your feedback and maybe trying to develop some of the ideas that I'm presenting in this paper a little bit further, so that's also helpful for me, because I think in a summer school the kind of instructor-student kind of structure is not as strong as it would be in a regular semester. So I'm here as a kind of as a professor, but also as a student in a way. Okay, so the paper I'm presenting, it's a part of a set of papers that I've been working on the problem of naturalism. So the reason why I've been working on a set of papers that are not yet have not yet coalesced in a larger project is that when it comes to naturalism, I have this fundamental intuition that there is something wrong with it. There is something that doesn't quite convince me. On the other hand, I'm still struggling to find like a clear and elegant way of explaining what it is, right? So what I feel like somebody who is sieging a fortress and is trying to kind of conduct the attack from different lines and trying to see how do we actually get in there. And so I've been working, generally when I have intuitions that I do not fully kind of understand, I like to see what great philosophers of the past have been thinking, about these things and trying to find some orientation. And Husserl is certainly one of them. One thing I find particularly attractive about Husserl's take, I would say, on the problem of naturalism, and this will probably become maybe even more clear in the second part of the afternoon when we do the reading, is that his strategy is not so much to attack naturalism on the basis or because allegedly naturalism fails to explain some kind of residual properties of the world. That's a very common strategy that you find sometimes, to say, oh, naturalism, works perfectly to explain X, Y, and Z, but hey, look, there are these like residual aspects of the world, call them qualia, call them values, call them, whatever you want, that naturalism doesn't really explain. Well, my problem with that strategy is that, as Giuseppina was saying earlier, you tend to be left with something very thin. So you have, maybe properties that are, somebody concedes that they are there, but they're causally inert. They don't really, have any substantial meaning for our philosophical understanding of the world. Husserl, on the contrary, does not adhere or does not follow this kind of logic of residue, right? So there are residues, and so naturalism doesn't fully explain, what we're supposed to explain. His approach is to say, well, no, naturalism actually, is a perfectly legitimate kind of scientific and philosophical approach to the world, and also it can be a comprehensive approach. So, in other words, we could put it this way: there are no phenomena that, in principle, you cannot try to investigate and explain from a naturalistic perspective. So, naturalism has its right. And it's a kind of comprehensive right. It's not just some portions of the mind or of the world. It's the whole thing. The only problem is that, Husserl would say, if naturalism is the only kind of intellectual habit you practice, and it's the only kind of methodological framework for scientific thinking, then there are going to be a lot of aspects about the world and about ourselves that you are going to neglect and to sort of lose sight of completely. So the point is not so much that in the naturalistic picture there are some residues. The point is, look, the picture is comprehensive, but if that's the only thing you practice, that's the only thing you know, then there is a whole lot about our kind of human existence in the world and the world itself that is just not going to come into view at all. So you're just going to miss out on a lot of stuff. And so the point, as we will see, is that we need to learn to have like a more robust and philosophically defensible position. We need to learn to practice different attitudes, so different ways of looking at the world, and there has to be a kind of mutual fertilization of a variety or a different set of attitudes vis-a-vis the world. As a footnote, but again, I'm going to talk more about this later, the idea is that naturalism is not just a thesis in metaphilosophy or something like that, but it's a much broader, a much more comprehensive, we could say, cultural phenomenon, and it has a lot to do not just with our way of theorizing about things, but literally with our way of looking at things. That's something Husserl insists upon. So it's not just a matter of it's not just one option on the philosophical market that is defined by a set of theses that we may buy or not buy, right? It's really like an intellectual habit. It's like a practice of thinking and a practice of life that prevents us from seeing certain things and encourages to only see some other things. So it's a matter of seeing before it's a matter of theorizing or of kind of philosophical constructions. So the specific topic of the paper, to go back and then I'm just going to start reading, is the problem of action. Action, I think, is a very vivid, is a very kind of clear example of what I'm talking about here. So you can have fundamentally different attitudes vis-a-vis one and the same phenomenon, action, and those will reveal, very different, completely different features of that phenomenon. So there is nothing that's residual about action that a purely naturalistic approach would fail to explain. So we can literally view human actions as natural events. Husserl is very clear about that. On the other hand, if we switch attitude and we take a phenomenological or a personalistic attitude, as we will see later, we will see that that naturalistic way of talking about action, while legitimate, is in a way derivative. So it's not only not the full story, but it's also something that, say, misconstrues or reduces in a kind of philosophically undesirable way what action actually is. Okay, so and then I hope eventually to kind of develop some of these ideas by tying into some of the sections of the book chapter that I distributed for the reading group. Okay, so my goal in this paper is to present and assess briefly Husserl's account of action in the Studien zur Struktur des Bewusstseins, a set of writings spanning the decade 1909-1920 and devoted to what he calls, quote, an unphilosophical phenomenology, end of quote. That is, a descriptive psychological phenomenology geared toward classification and interpretation of basic conscious phenomena prior to and independently of any consideration of the traditional problems of philosophy. So an interesting thing about these writings is that it's basically three big folders of manuscripts that Husserl had entrusted to his assistant in the early 20s, Ludwig Landgrabe, with the idea of producing like a major publication. Then he lost interest in it. That's what Husserl used to do always. Like he would, give huge portions of text to his assistants and would say, "Oh, why don't you try to, make a book out of it?" Then they would work like crazy for months and years, and then they would go back with an edited version of the manuscript with proposals of how to arrange the sections, etc. And he would say, "Oh, good," and he would just leave it on his desk, and because now he was already busy with something else. So people working at the Husserl archive basically found, had these 3 big folders and a couple of proposals for possible, ways of editing and arranging the manuscripts. And now the Studien zur Struktur des Bewusstseins are currently being edited at the Husserl archive, and people over there hope to actually publish in 4 volumes, these manuscripts by the end of next year. And this will also complete the publication of Husserl's collected works. So it's almost, I like to look at it as a kind of capstone set of writings, kind of, completing the long period of edition and publication of Husserl's unpublished manuscripts. So my paper is divided into 2 parts. In the first part, I present what I call Husserl's anatomy of an action, which can be simple or composite, and accordingly break down into a primary and secondary component. In the second part of the paper, I turn to consider the living body as the source of actions, and I offer a description of the subtle interplay of passivity and activity for the constitution of deliberate, goal-oriented actions. I conclude with some remarks about the philosophical lesson that we can learn about the problem of free will from these analyses. So, before turning to the concrete phenomenological analysis, let me remark in passing that the purportedly unphilosophical character of the Studien should not mislead us into thinking that they are philosophically irrelevant. So Husserl was clearly saying something when he said, das ist eine unphilosophische Phänomenologie. He wanted to say, well, look, this is descriptive work that we then have to kind of bring to fruition, and we then have to evaluate philosophically. But at first, this is just a matter of describing certain basic phenomena of consciousness. The philosophical import and the philosophical consequences, of this description remains to be developed, but in a second step. So Husserl, what is he doing here? He follows his characteristic tendency to suspend the terms in which philosophical problems are formulated by the tradition in order to examine the very presuppositions that underlie received formulations. The traditional problem haunting Husserl's analysis of action is the freedom of the will. So there is a traditional problem. However, rather than taking sides for one of the customary alternatives, determinism, indeterminism, compatibilism, etc., Husserl resorts to phenomenological descriptions to reframe the problem. As I will show in a moment, Husserl's phenomenological description questions the very idea of construing action as the effect of some cause, be it nature or a non-natural source of natural effects called the will. Thus, Husserl's account of action is both anti-naturalistic and anti-metaphysical because it disputes the very causal framework that is common to both the naturalistic and metaphysical conceptions of the will. Okay, so point number 1, the anatomy of an action. One of the main themes in the Studien is agency. In particular, Husserl is interested in providing what we could call the anatomy of an action. What are the essential components of an action? How do actions differ from other law-governed happenings in nature? What is the relationship between the will, as defined by the philosophical tradition, and individually occurring actions? Now, Husserl begins his analysis with the relatively uncontroversial claim that, quote, the I will entails the I can, end of quote. So, when I say I will, there is a kind of an implicit entailment in that statement or in that kind of project, and that implicit entailment is I can, right? I cannot will something that I know I can't, I cannot actually do. So there is an entailment here. But how is that entailment to be understood? Does it mean, quote, that I have the preliminary conviction that the event that I will eventually call my deed will occur as a causal consequence of my fiat, of my so be it? Now, so this is the question. So there is an entailment here between I will and I can, and the question is, how does that work? Does it mean that I have to kind of envision the kind of action, the kind of deed that, and be aware of it as possible, as something that I can do, and then eventually, I envision it as something that will be caused, right, by my decision, so be it, fiat. In order to initiate an action, okay, I necessarily need to have some consciousness of the process that the action is meant to actualize. This process, for instance, moving this watch from A to B, right, must be conscious as empirically possible. The limits of this possibility are dictated by the empirical nexus of nature in which the process is expected to occur. For example, I can imagine to knock down this building, with my hand. I can have a vivid fantasy of that action. However, I cannot seriously issue my fiat, so be it, right, and set out to initiate the process as an action, because I am aware of the empirical limits that make the success of the process impossible. Husserl is adamant that, quote, every physical process belongs in such unities of motivational becoming, and every action is also a physical process standing under laws and peculiarities of physical processes. So, there is no such thing as actions kind of happening in limbo or in some kind of neutral space. Actions are occurrence, that happen within an empirical nexus of nature, and that empirical nexus of nature has a bearing on precisely, the horizon of, those events or happenings that I can reasonably will as something that I can do. In this picture, one could imagine so we have kind of an empirical nexus of nature. We are part of it. We know what we can and what we can't based on that empirical nexus of nature, and that's the criterion, we could say, that delimits or that decides what can count as one of my actions and what cannot. Now, in this picture, one could imagine the work of the will as one of intervention, right? So that is, the will intervenes in the nexus of physical nature by giving an impulse, which then initiates a chain of purely physical natural events, right? So there is a natural nexus of nature, there is something called the will. It's a source of, a certain kind of causality. When it intervenes, right, there is an impulse, and then a natural process begins or occurs. However, this description would be phenomenologically problematic for Husserl. When I decide, for example, to kick a ball in order to give a certain direction to it, to make it fly into the net, for example, it is the whole movement of my leg that has to be described as voluntary, and not just a mere impulse, of which the leg movement would be a mere causal consequence. If I consider the whole action, for instance, deciding to score a goal in a soccer game, then there is a significant phenomenological difference between the two segments of the action. So now I will display my legendary drawing skills. So suppose, here's the net, and here's the ball, right, flying into the net, and here's the leg. So we could say this is a composite action. We have two components to it. This would be, leg to ball, that would be number one. And then there would be ball to net. This would be number two. Okay. So I would say there is a significant phenomenological difference between 1 and 2. Leg movement to kick and kick to ball in the net. The whole process can be legitimately characterized as an action because the physical event under consideration would not have occurred, the ball would not be in the net at the end, if I hadn't decided to initiate it. But while segment 2 is a mere physical natural event that could have occurred also under other circumstances. For example, a gust of wind could have moved my leg and make it hit the ball appropriately. Segment 1 is, in Husserl's terminology, the primary action, or the creative action, the one that carries the property of voluntariness in the eminent sense. So the whole thing is the action. The whole thing, deserves to be called voluntary. So the will is not this cause that simply, initiates the impulse, and then the leg movement and the cake is just the causal consequence of that. It's the whole package, that deserves to be called voluntary. But there is one segment of the whole package that, carries the property of voluntariness in the eminent sense, and this would be what he calls the creative or the primary segment of the action. This distinction leads Husserl to demarcate sharply the natural causal component from the voluntary component of an action. While actions do have causal consequences in the world, and they always occur also as physical events standing under natural laws, the initiation of an action cannot be described as a form of causation, in which something called the will would cause the action in the same sense in which the foot strike causes the ball to fly into the net. Now, here's how Husserl summarizes the distinction. I have a somewhat longer quote. So, quote, the "if I want, I can" pertains to the action both in its creative and in its secondary segments. If I want, I can raise the hand, I can sing a tune, etc., but I can also get that man over there to stand up through my call, and such mediate consequences. How about causation? If I carry out the call, if I say, Giuseppina, would you please come here, the consequence occurs secondarily. So the person over there stands up and comes to me. If I hit with the cue in such and such a way, the ball rolls to the corner of the billiard table, etc. These are empirically necessary consequences, that is, they are conditioned merely as natural consequences, empirical consequences in nature, through the hit, etc. As far as the primary action, the creative action is concerned, however, it may or may not be conditioned in whatever way according to natural necessity. From a phenomenological point of view, it does not manifest itself as a mere physical consequence of another process. By contrast, the primary action is creative and voluntary. End of quote. So in this set of manuscripts, Husserl, I think, has effectively reached some interesting phenomenological insights. He has criticized the view of the will as the causal source of actions. So according to this view, the will is construed as a point-like source of inputs that initiate causal processes in the natural world. By contrast, for Husserl, will does not name the hidden source of actions, but rather the extensional property of certain processes in the world. That is, a characteristic that is spread over the whole action in each of its phases. For precisely this reason, actions must be carefully analyzed in terms of the primary or creative segment, which is the one that carries the original creative voluntary force of the action, and the ensuing segments that are merely caused in the empirical natural sense by the primary action. And as we said, that could have been also caused by something else, like the gust of wind. And I would say that, so causation describes well the relationship between 1 and 2, so between the primary segment and the secondary segments, but it does not describe well the way in which the primary creative segment comes about in the first place. So, causation is a good way of describing what happens between 1 and 2, but, according to Husserl, it's not a good way of describing how one comes about, in the first place. Perhaps the tendency to interpret actions as causal events depends on the tendency to extend the internal causal link between primary and secondary segment in a composite action to the action as a whole, including the primary creative segment. So the idea is we have this model that 1 causes 2, that works well as an internal way of describing what's going on. And so the reason why we tend to interpret the whole thing as something caused by something else, it's because we extend the kind of range of that concept to the totality of the action under scrutiny. So, however, closer scrutiny reveals that the experiential conditions to subsume an action as a whole under the category natural event are missing. One could say that the intention natural event is only partially fulfilled by the intuitive experience of an action. In other words, an action is definitely an event, and an event that happens in the nexus of nature, but it is not an event that is experienced as caused by an antecedent factor, thus violating the condition for direct apprehension in terms of natural causality. Husserl writes, quote, "The action appears, the will objectifies itself in it, but not in such a way as if an empirical relation between will and happening in terms of empirical necessity appeared. This is not an event apprehended in objective terms, to which another event follows in an empirically necessary fashion." End of quote. Now, once this phenomenological difference has been clarified, once this phenomenological difference has been clarified, Husserl still has to explain why, then, a causal apprehension of the relationship between will and action is nonetheless possible. In other words, why do we tend to objectify the creative upwelling of the action in an antecedent cause? This possibility, of course, must be granted. So Husserl is not trying to say that we are completely kind of missing the mark when we look at actions as causal events. He has told us that there is, of course, natural causality going on here, that there is a specific juncture, we could say, where that natural causality can be located, that we tend to kind of objectify the whole thing as a natural event or as something caused by something else. But he has to explain why that would be something that we are likely to do, right? Even if it's phenomenologically speaking unwarranted for him or misleading, there has to be a reason why we nonetheless can do it. And we all make sense of it. We all make sense of what it means to view an action as kind of a fully kind of causal event. So, like I was saying, this possibility must be granted. Otherwise, it would be inexplicable why the tendency to interpret actions as causally dependent from something called the will is so widely spread. Husserl's answer is that the causal apprehension of actions is a matter of reflective distortion. So the idea is there is a kind of distortion going on when we reflect on actions as opposed to when we just act or live through actions. What does it mean? In other words, quote, he says, "It is possible to implement a gaze of intellectual reflection and thereby a positing of being in which the will is posited," right? So we posit this kind of causal origin or causal source, called the will, but this is not the stance that we take in volitions and in the production of action. So in other words, we could say that this model, right, that there is something called the will that causes actions into the world, is a model that stems from what we do when we reflect upon actions, and kind of guided by the notion of causality, where you always need an antecedent cause, we almost sort of automatically posit something that carries or that fulfills that role, and that's where the origin of our understanding of our representation, of our idea of the will comes from. So thus, the will in the Studien, I would say, has the same destiny as reason in Ideas 1. For those of you who are familiar with the first book of Ideas in Husserl, there is a section on reason where Husserl says that reason is not to be understood as a mental faculty, so it is no longer interpreted as a distinctive mental faculty whose workings bring about conscious acts called actions, but rather as a property characterizing a certain class of conscious acts as such. So Willentlichkeit as an extensive property, so voluntariness as an extensive property inherent in actions, replaces der Wille, so the will, as the causal source of actions. There is a similar move, like I was saying in Ideas 1, where the idea is, reason is not this mental power that brings about, certain entities called cognitions or something like that, but it's a relation that holds among acts of consciousness, in particular acts in which we are emptily talking about something, as opposed to actions where we are talking about something that we are actually seeing, that that's there in the flesh before our eyes. So positing and talking about something when that something is present to us, to either our physical gaze or our mental gaze, well, that for Husserl is, we could say, the mark of reason. And the relation that holds between empty intentions and fulfilling intentions is for Husserl, the original site, the original locus of what we call reason. Okay, so number 2, second section, bodily freedom as presupposition for the enactment of willful actions. So the above analysis should not be taken to amount to a rejection of the simple and quite uncontroversial intuition that actions must spring from some subjective source. So we have said, okay, the will is not the causal source, but we should not think that, okay, then actions are just these kind of, free-floating events in nature that are just there. No, so it's uncontroversial that actions must have, some subjective origin. The question is just, okay, how do we reformulate that once we have gotten rid of the will as the causal source? So in this second section, I want to turn to Husserl's characterization of the body as the source of willful actions, in particular to his description of involuntary and yet meaning-laden bodily movements as the ground for higher-level voluntary activity. So it is plain to see that the primary creative segment, so segment number 1 in the drawing, at least of a physical action, right? But I will leave aside intellectual actions for the purpose of the present paper. It would also be an interesting question to ask, is there such a thing as an intellectual action, right? Or do intellectual movements, in one sense, fall under the same broad category of action, and is it like a good classification or not? Or do actions necessarily need to be physical? But this is not a question I want to tackle here. So it is plain to see that the primary creative segment of an action is necessarily accomplished through the body. It is only through my body as part of the nexus of nature that I can act and thereby initiate causal processes in the world. So the I can, which, as we have seen, is necessarily entailed in the I will, has to be interpreted in a corporeal sense. I can means necessarily I, this bodily subject, can. In other words, the freedom of the will presupposes and flows from the freedom of the body. Of course, these are in scare quotes in my paper because I just said that, talking about the will is improper, but, to tie back to the philosophical tradition, we could say freedom of the will presupposes and flows from the freedom of the body, which, as we will see, has the crucial function of pre-constituting possible paths for willful action. So the body has this function of pre-constituting possible lines of action, possible paths, as Husserl says, for willful action. Now, this view is far from obvious, considering that the relationship between bodily movement and movement of the soul has often been construed as antagonistic. One example, Kant. This is how Kant famously characterizes bodily movements in the second critique. Quote, if the freedom of our will were none other than the latter, so bodily freedom, then it would be at bottom nothing better than the freedom of a turnspit, which, when once it is wound up, also accomplishes its movement of itself. So the idea is, if our model for freedom, and this is an implicit critique of Hobbes, of course, if our conception of freedom is just, freedom to move around in space, bodily freedom, well, then we could say that a turnspit, with a big roast hanging on it, that's also free, because once you wind it up, then it keeps moving by itself. So implicitly Kant is saying, well, our body is just that. It's this kind of, physical mechanism that has been wound up at some point and just, keeps moving as long as it, as long as it is alive. Kant famously, however, sets up against this kind of freedom, so the freedom of the turnspit, the transcendental freedom or absolute freedom as, quote, independence from everything empirical and so from nature generally, end of quote. Both quotes are from the second critique. Now, but if freedom is the ability to consciously carry out goal-oriented actions that have been chosen by the subject, what is then the medium, so to speak, in which such ability is grounded? In other words, in order to choose a certain course of action and issue my fiat, the course of action must be somehow pre-given to me. I must be aware of it somehow before I say, okay, let's do it, okay, so be it. It has to be pre-constituted as a practicable path that is consistent with my factual abilities. The world has to show up as the meaningful locus of various practical possibilities that are experienced as mine before the actual action planning and acting take place. The source of this pre-constitution for Husserl is the body. Not so much the body as consciously governed and steered by a transcendental ego, so not the body as the organ of the will, we could say, which is one of the figures of the body in Husserl's phenomenology, but as he calls it, the pre-egoic, the pre-egological lived body, whose meaning-oriented interactions with the world delineate possible paths for action. That is, the consciousness of the I can, which precedes and makes actual volitions possible. The emergence of practical intentions is described as a kind of reenactment of involuntary bodily movements that is not past-directed as mere representational recollection of past bodily movements, but future-directed in the specific mode of willing. So, just to explain this a little bit, maybe if some of you are slightly familiar with the more logical Husserl, the stuff on, for instance, experience and judgment, the relationship between acts of judging and acts of perceiving an object and sorting out, explicating its properties. There we find this interesting thesis that the synthesis that happens in judgment, so the synthesis, for instance, between a subject and a predicate, is prefigured, so to speak, in low-level syntheses that happen already in perception, right? So when I say S is P, the desk is brown, right? What I'm doing is I'm putting together, I'm operating a synthesis between a subject and a predicate, but that synthesis does not put together two otherwise completely disconnected concepts, right? There is a sense in which if I look at what I do when I perceive, for example, I start by perceiving the desk as a whole. I kind of cast a glance on the desk. I'm not aware, I'm not looking at each of its properties, so to speak, in isolation. I'm just looking at the whole thing. Then what I can do is I can kind of redirect the focus of my attention, and now I decide that I'm looking at the color of the desk. So the property brown emerges out of the perceptual whole and is now in the foreground. But it does not emerge as a second object beside the desk. So the color property of the desk is not, not I'm looking at the desk, now I'm looking at something else, I'm looking at the property. No, it's the desk viewed through the property of being brown. So now there is a kind of lens through which I'm looking at the object, and I'm aware that it is the same object that was present to me before as a whole that is now being viewed through the lens or through the perspective of that particular property. And there, Husserl says, there occurs a kind of synthesis. If I keep exploring the object and kind of focusing on other properties, all these properties are attributed to the underlying whole object that was given to me in perception. And that synthesis for Husserl is passive. So it's not me putting together, kind of through some kind of intellectual activity, the disconnected property brown and the object desk, but the synthesis happens, so to speak, passively. And one of his theses in Experience and Judgment is that the active synthesis of judgment, when I actually say the desk is brown, S is P, is not something that we just do out of the blue, but at least in the sphere of perceptual judgments, is a reenactment. It's a kind of active revisiting of the passive synthesis that was happening at the level of simple perception. So we're not doing something completely new. We are redoing, we are reoperating, that passive synthesis that was going on, but now we are guided by an active theoretical interest. So we want to actually perform the synthesis ourselves. We don't want it to just happen in perception. So the thesis here is that this is precisely, or something very similar happens in the sphere of action. So our kind of, meaningful bodily interactions with our environment, like I was saying, not the consciously operated, consciously steered body, of the transcendental ego, but, just my body kind of meaningfully inhabiting a certain space, pre-delineates passively, some possible paths for actions, and then voluntary decision to, deciding now I'm going to go ahead and do this or that. Well, those actions, in the more kind of traditional sense, have to be viewed as revisitation, reenactments, guided by kind of an explicit act of willing, of these kind of passively pre-constituted paths or itineraries, we could say, within the sphere of our experience. So there is a kind of parallelism, or a kind of, we could say, isomorphism almost, between the structure of theoretical reason, the activity of judgment, and the structure of practical reason, agency, in this kind of passive-active interplay. Okay, so the description goes more or less like this. So Husserl begins by describing, quote, the play of originary, involuntary bodily movements, end of quote, as the native soil of all agency. Agency arises out of and returns to the original bodily mobility that is already in play prior to all explicit, goal-directed action planning. Thanks to the work of self-affection, and maybe I'm just going to comment on this briefly, originally involuntary bodily movements can knock at the door of the ego, as he says metaphorically, and urge the ego to turn its attention toward them. So what is self-affection? Well, as you may know, Husserl has this view that we are always self-conscious, so that self-consciousness always accompanies our subjective life, our experience. So self-consciousness is not something that happens only through second-order acts of reflection, but is kind of built into the very structure of all of our activities. In that, I think, is very similar to Kant and to other philosophers who do not have a second-order theory of self-awareness or self-consciousness, but believe that it is a constitutive ingredient of subjective life as a whole. Not only that, but he believes that there is a sense in which our subjective life also has this ability to affect itself. What does it mean? It means that it's not like the only experiences or the only subjective occurrences that affect us are, for instance, sensations, right, coming in somehow from the world and demanding our attention. So there is a loud noise, something affects me, and then I turn around and try to figure out what it is. Husserl believes that our experiences ourselves, not only the content of our experiences, but our experiences ourselves, have at least potentially this kind of self-affective trait. In other words, we could say that in experience we're not just in touch with objects, but we're always, at least tacitly, in touch with ourselves, right? With our own experiences, and that's why at any moment we can decide to make those experiences objects of an explicit consideration. So, for example, like I said, suppose I suddenly hear a loud noise, right? In Husserl's terminology, there is something affecting me from the acoustic field, right? And under the appropriate conditions, I will turn my attention toward it and objectify what I was hearing as something, I don't know, somebody broke a glass in the next room or something like that. Okay, But not only that, we could say not only the loud noise, but also the experience itself of the loud noise is affecting me while I'm undergoing it. That's why, at any moment I could decide to turn my attention not to the noise per se, but to my experience of the noise. For example, I can say, hey, wow, that was loud, right? Or I can say, hey, that was really kind of disturbing because I was trying to present a paper and that completely disrupted my attention and the other people's attention. So experiences, you have to think of it this way: when an experience occurs, there is something that affects me in the content of the experience, but there is something that affects me also in the experience per se. So there are these two levels of affection. And the second level is what Husserl calls self-affection. And there are several degrees, so we're always kind of doing this kind of self-affective thing, but normally we do not pay attention to it. Normally we're just turned toward objects. And it's important because for Husserl, we could say that our conscious life is always a matter of different affections competing against each other to catch our attention. That's what conscious life is like. So our field of consciousness is this kind of arena in which competing inputs, competing affections are kind of fighting to win the attention of the ego. Then the ego will turn its attention and kind of objectify, turn toward the affection that has the upper hand, or that won, we could say, the competition. By the way, just to complete the thought, Husserl is not an empiricist, so he doesn't believe that simply the strongest, most vivid affection will necessarily win. Because if I am absorbed in a very difficult Husserlian manuscript, I might, even if there is a super loud noise and a car crash and people screaming for help, I, the insensitive academic, might continue. I'm too absorbed in this. I'm figuring this out. The world can wait. So these things happen, right? So for Husserl to be able to produce like a theory of affection and how affection and attention go hand in hand, we cannot just resort to a facile empiricistic view that the stronger affection will win. But now there is an important distinction. So I was talking about self-affection here, because we're trying to figure out how do we get from kind of involuntary bodily interactions in the world to actions. We said an important role is played by self-affection. But Husserl says here that there are so that self-affection comes into two fundamentally distinct varieties. There is an attentional with a self-affection, it says. So attentional is the word. And what is it? Is it simply generates the tendency to reproduce in memory the movement that has been just performed. Think about these are subtle things to describe, but I was trying to figure out what he has in mind here. For example, suppose I'm sitting on my chair, I'm just fidgeting with my leg, right, as we sometimes do while we're writing or something, and that movement, which is involuntary, at some point I become aware that I'm fidgeting, right? And then I stop, right? And for a millisecond later, there is this kind of, we could say echo of the movement I was doing that is still present somehow in my consciousness. I might actually kind of re-perform briefly the movement in my memory. For instance, just to tell myself, I should really stop fidgeting because it's really annoying for people sitting next to me, etc. So one way in which our experiences, our movements, affect us, so have this kind of self-affective property, one way is just merely attentional. So I perform a certain movement and then I just reproduce it. I just look at it, just for the fun of it, so to speak. Or for instance, suppose I have a shoulder problem, and at some point I perform a certain movement involuntarily, and I hear a pop, and I'm like, thankfully no pain, but a second later I'm like, oh, did I just do that? And I'm just kind of replaying that movement that I was just involuntarily doing actively, right? not because I want to do something in particular. It's just, you know, a matter of re-evoking, you know, the movement. But there is also a specifically practical kind of self-affection which generates the tendency to transpose the movement just performed as a practical possibility in the future, thereby creating the conditions for actual intentional agency. So the second, he calls it specifically practical self-affection. So here, it's not just a matter of reperforming the movement in my memory, just, you know, for the fun of it, or just because it was something that was unusual, or for whatever other reason. But, you know, when the movement affects me, the involuntary movement affects me in that particular way as an enticing possibility, as, you know, something that I could actually do, as opposed to just involuntarily happen, you know, to perform, well, that creates the condition then for actual intentional agency. Now, Husserl specifies that this is not so much a transposition in the strict sense. So it's not like, you know, I'm doing something, I remember, hey, this is actually something I could do actively. This is a movement that I could actually do, and now I set out to do it. So it's not just transposing something in the future. It is a kind, as he says, it is a kind of a perception of the present sensory situation according to the sense arising from a past sensory situation. So we could say there is a kind of sensory scenario that opens up to me that a certain involuntary bodily movement revealed, right? That bodily movement that revealed that scenario now kind of affects me, but in a particular way that kind of forces me almost to apprehend the sensory scenario as something that could fit, as something that could be apt, we could say, for my action. Let me give you an example. So suppose that, you know, I'm sitting at my desk and I'm working hard on a paper that is long overdue. My attention is completely absorbed in the writing process, but while that happens, my body does not stand still. Suppose, you know, I am unconsciously adjusting my sitting position on the chair. That happens, right? You're trying to sit comfortably. So I feel that I'm not sitting comfortably, but I'm not paying attention to it. What I'm actually doing is I'm writing my paper. But while I'm doing it, you know, I'm not standing still. Suddenly, one movement strikes the optimal position, right? But this is just a moment in the continuous flow of unconscious bodily movement. So the body keeps moving, but the movement leading to the optimal position affects me. You know, it stands out and catches my attention. I'm like, oh, that was good. That felt good, right? Just a moment ago, I just found it. I just found the comfortable position. So what happens is it comes forward as a practical possibility. So I decide to deliberately move in the right position and finally sit comfortably on the chair. Similarly, as I enter a new room at the museum, suppose, you know, I'm visiting a museum, I enter a new room, my eyes move around, I inspect the room with cursory glances, but one particular area of the room stands out because of the bright color of the paintings hanging there. I then redirect my eyes deliberately toward that area before making the decision to actually go there and contemplate the paintings. So there is a kind of wandering around of my gaze, right? Then there is one particular position, kind of oculomotory position of my eyes that, you know, affects me and strikes me as something that I could actually pursue deliberately. And that's when I kind of decide to put myself on the path that particular bodily movement delineated or pre-constituted, in Husserl's language, for me. So Husserl comments the situation, or Husserl comments situations of this kind by reference to the famous saying, quote, "Where there's a will, there's a way," end of quote. In German, it's, you know, wo ein Wille ist, da ist auch ein Weg. Now in German, I don't know if in English too, but in German that has a slightly negative ring. So, you know, where, you know, wo ein Wille ist, da ist auch ein Weg means, you know, that you are ready to do whatever it takes, you know, to achieve something. Is that the case in English too? Yeah. Because in Italian we have volere e potere. which is slightly different. I mean, the idea is if you will, you can, but that's the opposite of what he's trying to say here. So that if you really want something, you also can achieve it, right? Whether that's true is a different story. Anyway, so he starts, with this kind of piece of common sense. Where there is a will, there is a way, and he writes, quote, "Each will as decisional, affirmative, and authentic will refers to a path of the will, which is represented together with the will. However, in general, the path of the will is not just any path that is possible. Rather, the event... However, in general, the path of the will is not just any event that is possible. Rather, the event must be conscious from the beginning as a practicable path." So in other words, we could say our will does not operate in a kind of, trials and error way, 100%. It's not like, there is a million things we could do, there is a million courses of actions that we could take as our actions, and, we'll just try some, and then I find out that, hey, I can not knock down the building with my hand, so I'm just going to try to knock down something smaller. No, there is a sense in which that, rich and complex texture, we could say, of bodily interactions in the environment has already pre-delineated, pre-configured a web of practical possibilities such that, my will is able to kind of recognize the paths of experiences that are eligible, we could say, are eligible to become an action, and those that are not. So the idea is that the spectrum of practical possibilities is grounded eidetically, so essentially, in the spectrum of bodily possibilities. It is the body in its myriad meaningful interactions with the world that prefigures possible practicable ways or paths for actual acts of willing to occur. So we could conclude that in this analysis of the body, what emerges is not so much the body as the organ of the will, but as the matrix of agency itself, as the source of Willentlichkeit, of voluntariness. So the body replaces here the will as a distinct metaphysical source of free actions. So we could say that the vacancy that left, by the will is filled somehow by the body. But the body, not so much again as an organ that is consciously steered by, some superior subjectivity, but the body as this kind of, meaningfully interactional entity that is already in the world before we set out to act in this or that way. So free actions flow from an intricate nexus of passive, pre-egological bodily interactions with the environment that are already characterized by a distinctive pre-deliberative kind of freedom. So we could say that by contrast with a philosophical position that would counterpose or set up against each other actions as the mark of practical reason, as opposed to a bunch of kind of pre-rational happenings in the psychology and the physiology of our body. Here we have a more kind of continuist view, right? So there is a sense in which our actions kind of arise out of these meaningful interactions with the world of the body, and there is a sense in which anti-naturalism is not just a matter of kind of preserving actions from being reduced to the nexus of nature, but it's a kind of anti-naturalism all the way down. The idea is that already the kind of meaning-guided and meaning-laden interactions of the body with the environment, right, are not just, in one sense, natural events in the sense of being kind of meaning-indifferent happenings, right, but they are already meaning-governed phenomena. And the idea is that then, Kant's view that, bodily freedom, if that were, all the freedom that there is, it would be just the freedom of a turnspit. Well, Husserl would say, well, no, there is a kind of pre-deliberative, kind of pre-practical reason kind of freedom that is the matrix and that is the native soil for the kind of agency that we are more accustomed with, and it has to do with positing a goal and choosing the means, and all the stuff that moral philosophers like to talk about. So, conclusion. So I'm trying to say just a half page. What's the philosophical lesson? Because so far I think we could say this could be somehow unphilosophical in Husserl's sense. It's a bunch of descriptions, and you can like them or you can improve them. That's what I like about phenomenology. The point is not to knock down an argument and get a better argument. There is also that, but the key thing is, look, there are good descriptions, bad descriptions, better descriptions of a certain phenomenon, and so the whole debate and the whole controversy arises on how to best describe certain phenomena, with the idea that there are our descriptions are not completely subjective, or you can have a better description, and you can kind of reasonably argue about what's the best way to describe a certain phenomenon. But here at the end, I wanted to try and articulate what I think we can learn, philosophically speaking, in a more traditional sense, from these analyses. Which this was just a sketch, but like I was saying, there's 4 volumes, and I would lie if I told you that I read all of them. So there is more work to be done, obviously. So the broader philosophical lesson that we can learn from the above analysis, I think, is twofold. First, Husserl shows that both the naturalistic construal of actions as natural causal events and the metaphysical construal of actions as emanations of a non-natural entity called the will are at odds with our experience. Actions are sui generis natural events that emerge from the originary free play of bodily movements in a meaningful environment. The pressing philosophical issue is thus no longer the ontological status of actions in a uniformly deterministic nature, but rather the ontological status of the body as the locus of freedom within the nexus of nature. So we have transferred, we could say, the kind of philosophically pressing problem. The problem is not how do we kind of fit actions in a world that's uniformly kind of causally determined in the sense of natural scientific causality, but the question is, what's the position, what's the status of the body as this kind of very distinctive and unique entity within the nexus of nature that has, we could say, this kind of element of freedom built into it all the way down. Second, so this was the first thing, so we have kind of reframed, kind of configured the philosophical problem. Then second, in so doing, I think Husserl is redirecting our attention from the problem of the position of actions within nature to the problem of the position of actions within consciousness. So we could say the problem is not how are actions possible within a uniformly deterministic nature. The problem is what is the status of action within the overarching nexus of conscious life. What is their position, in the totality, in the overarching whole, which is consciousness. Now, once the proper place of actions in the natural world has been redescribed in such a way as to dispel the naturalistic tendency to equate actions with physical natural events, the new horizon of questions pertains to the place of actions within the broader nexus of consciousness. In other words, a complete phenomenology of action should provide both a static description of actions, by contrast to other acts of consciousness, and a genetic description of the emergence of actions from other, more basic types of conscious occurrences. In the Studien, Husserl has laid the groundwork for these descriptions, but he has not developed them in full. I think this is a task for contemporary phenomenologists to take on. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we have some time for questions now. In our haste to start, I forgot to actually pass on these. So
okay.
Retrospectively. So, any questions? Who would like to start?
Well, thank you so much, Andrea. That was really fascinating. I've got a couple of questions, but I think just for starters, I'll go with the first one, and then you can put me back at the end of the queue. So one of the things I found really, really fascinating about Husserl's take on effectively a sort of autonomy of the human sciences by looking at the phenomenological attitudes in play is this idea of the path of the will.
Mm-hmm.
Because even that terminology itself is not just interesting because of how it contrasts, obviously, with the kind of quantitative, nomothetic, natural scientific terminology of how one understands physiology in action. But it suggests that Husserl seems to talk about the will in terms of a narrative, almost.
Mm-hmm.
So the genetic story is not a purely biological or cognitive scientific issue.
No.
There is a sort of hermeneutic
Mm-hmm.
analysis at play. And if that's the case, that the body plays such a crucial role, is it fair to say that Husserl is developing some sort of proto notion of what could be called somatic intentionality,
Mm-hmm.
in addition to discursive intentionality, which is obviously from Kant and worked through to Hegel and then right through to Sellers? Because if it's somatic intentionality which is really crucial for the phenomenological attitude, does that suggest that actually most philosophers' attempts at recently rehabilitating intentionality by looking purely at intellectual domains of agency are equally one-sided, just as naturalism is? So naturalism biases quantitative rationality over qualitative rationality, whereas now the critiques of naturalism seem to be equally one-sided, to use Hegel's term, whereas they're biasing qualitative rationality over quantitative dimensions by looking at the body.
Yeah, that's very good. Do you want me to answer that,
Yeah.
or you go with the second first?
So the second question was just a very, very minor query just about self-affection, but we'll cover. Yeah.
Okay.
Later.
No, thank you. I mean, this is it's a great question. You're talking about bodily intentionality, or how do you call it?
Well, you could call it somatic intentionality.
Somatic,
I'm using Carl Sachs's very helpful term.
Sure. Yeah. No, I do think, there is of course something like that, and I would say probably the most famous phenomenologist to try to spell out, all the consequences from this intuition is Merleau-Ponty. And of course, there is a kind of a rehabilitation of, sensory motor intentionality. Think about, the inactive approach to perception, ecological perception. So there is work being done also at the intersection between cognitive science and phenomenology philosophy that I think tries to explore that idea that, the way in which the body relates to the environment is somehow meaning governed or kind of meaning laden from the very start. So we already have kind of, as people like Alva Noah and others would put it, these sensory motor skills or these sensory motor schemes that are proto-conceptual. There is this whole language. My only thing is, the question that I always have is how much of that way of looking at the body, how much does it really depart from naturalism, or how much is it a way to kind of, because I think in one sense you have two options here. We could put it this way. So if you are like a strict physicalist, right, you could say that the body is a kind of strange entity. If you look at it in these terms, right? It's a strange entity because it's not just a more complex version of a pebble, right? But it's something, fundamentally different, kind of ontologically different. It's a different ontological kind, we could say. I remember once I was talking to a kind of an analytic philosopher of mind, and I asked him, so what do you think? We talk about the mind-body problem, right? But would the terms of the problem fundamentally change if we tackled the mind-stone problem instead? So if our question were, how is it possible that, a mind attaches to a stone? And we had a brief discussion, and at the end he basically said, well, actually no, right? Because I mean, the idea is, there is this nature which is uniformly deterministic. It's a button, just particles and whatever energies, whatever you want to call it, and so the body is just a very complex version of that, right? Whereas here we're trying to say, well, no, the body is something that already at its most fundamental levels is already kind of a meaning-governed entity, right? And so the point for me would be to say, if we want to do justice, I think, to the uniqueness of the body, within, and if we really want to have a theory of somatic intentionality that's not just an appendix to a kind of naturalistic, otherwise naturalistic view of the world, we also need something like a somatic ontology. So we need to be able to talk about, what's the kind of entity that has somatic intentionality as one of its kind of constituent or constitutive elements. So, and that's something that it's probably underdeveloped in traditions other than phenomenology. Then the other question would be, what's the difference between Husserl and Merleau-Ponty about the role of the body? My hunch, although this is a topic that I still have to research in more detail, is that for Husserl there is nonetheless a fundamental, we could say, almost a quantum leap, right, between just meaningful bodily interaction and then action. So we cannot just reduce action to the far end of the spectrum, the far end of the continuum that starts with me fidgeting, right? So deciding to stand up and going to see a friend is not just a very complex version of me fidgeting while reading. So that I think would be a misconstrual. So the idea is, for Husserl, when the ego then intervenes, when then the ego issues a fiat, so be it, then of course, the action that will now occur has been prefigured and kind of pre-delineated, pre-constituted in the bodily interactions, but now it kind of enters a new space, and we could call it a space of reasons, a space of normativity. Now it's beholden to standards that are not present, of course, at the level of like pure kind of involuntary bodily interaction. So there is both a continuum, meaning that actions are not these kind of strange mental occurrences that happen against the background of a completely naturalistic, deterministic psychology and physiology, but there is also a category kind of leap, or a categorical difference when we enter the sphere of deliberate action proper. And so we have to also kind of consider other aspects. So this is like the very kind of rudimentary basis of where agency comes from. But that does not mean that agency is just the very complex version of what we're talking about here. I don't know if that helps in any way or.
No, it certainly does. Can I have a very quick follow-up?
Should we move?
Actually, you know what?
Another question,
move on,
just because we don't have too much time, and then maybe we can come back.
I have two adjacent questions, and they are just questions of, find out what exactly is happening here. When the action, I will, therefore I can, something like that you said, and then I experience the action as mine, you also said. But how can I experience the action as mine if I haven't done it yet? That's the first question. And then just now in discussion, you said that there is this basic gathering of like information or stuff, pre-discursive kind of somatic knowledge or whatever, before you go and do the action, which is the next step. But how about if it's an action that you haven't done before? What exactly do you...
That's a very good question. I mean, the first question I think is easily answered. The second question is less easily answered. So the first question, I think, what I was trying to say is that Husserl says that there is a kind of entailment. When I say I will, for instance, I will move my watch from the desk to my pocket, right? So there is an I can. There is an implicit awareness that this is the sort of thing that I can do, right? So what does it mean that it is experienced as mine? You said, if I haven't done it yet. So the idea is this. You can also view the process. So when I want to act in a certain way, we could say that I want a certain process to happen in the world. So I want a world in which the watch is no longer on the desk, but is in my pocket. So this is the world I want. I can also look at the process as something that could also happen, otherwise. So not because I make it happen, but again, gust of wind, or somebody takes it and puts it in my pocket, or whatever. But Husserl wants to say, well, there is a sense in which the process called watch goes from desk to pocket, right, is not a process that first you're kind of, contemplating it as, again, kind of a neutral event, and then you go ahead and do it. There is a sense in which that process in the world bears the mark, mine, we could say, so it's a practical possibility for me before I decide to go ahead and do it. I could say it's within my range, right? It's within the range of processes that I can decide to be the cause of. That would be the idea. So it's mine in the sense that it's not kind of a neutral thing out there that I then decide kind of from the outside to realize, but it's part of a web of possibilities, right, that are mine before I actually choose to make one of them my action. That's the idea. The second idea, how do we do something that's completely new? That's a very interesting question, and it would have to do, in order to answer that, we should take into account and describe more thoroughly the temporality that is involved in actions, and the complex dynamic of anticipation and sort of expectation and fulfillment of expectation that goes hand in hand with the realization of the action, right? So, in other words, actions are not realized, at one fell swoop, in one blow. There is always there are steps, so there are phases to the action, and we could say that every phase can be fulfilled, or there can be kind of a frustration of my expectation. So, for example, I really want the watch over there to be in my pocket, then I start to move my arm to grab it, and then it doesn't work, and I remember, oh dear, true, I broke my arm the other day, so unfortunately that's not something I can actually do, right? So in this case, I will, have to resort to something else. So why am I mentioning this? Because you could generalize this kind of dynamics also to actions that I haven't performed before. We could say the empirical web or the empirical network of practical possibilities that I experience as mine, we could say has fringes, right, at the edges. So I know that I could continue. I could, for example, if I'm a weightlifter, I know that I can, I can bench 70 pounds. Maybe I can also bench 71. I surely cannot bench, 3,000 pounds. That's not going to happen. So where do I draw the line between, an action that I can actually do and one that I cannot? Well, it's experimental, and it's, this kind of, filling out the details of the fringes, of the edges of, the horizon of my practical possibilities. So it's a constant negotiation. It's, projecting onto the world the stuff that you can do, and negotiating, the kind of porous border between what you can do and what you haven't tried yet.
I get that, but just one small question. Yes, I can see the point with 70 pounds and 71 pounds, but let's say stealing a watch, if you haven't stolen anything before, stealing a watch is a totally different action to just wanting the watch to be from there here, and that is a totally it's a sort of totally new action, and it's not a matter of extending my arm and reaching and putting it in my pocket. It's all sorts of other things, how things like that happen if you haven't stolen anything.
Very good to know. Here I would say, first of all, I would hesitate to say it's a completely different action, because if I do not extend my arm, grab the watch and put it in my pocket, I haven't stolen it. It's still there, right? So there is a sense in which I still want a certain event to occur in the world, But there is also kind of a new layer, so to speak, that's kind of added onto it, and that would be kind of a moral kind of value. So if in contemporary idiom we could say that the kind of moral property of that action supervenes on the action in the more basic sense of just, kind of moving the watch from A to B. So think of it this way. Suppose, I'm a bad guy, or I've never been a bad guy before, but there is a watch and I really like it, and I'm like, or I'm distracted. I'm like, okay, I'm gonna grab it. Nobody's gonna see it. I'm trying something new. Then I steal it. Then I go back to my room, and I feel like repentance or regret, etc. I take it out and I realize, wait a minute, this is actually my watch, right? I was thinking I was going to do, the bad thing, but actually, I don't know, some angel kind of, got prevented me from doing it, and I just, put my own watch into the pocket. We could say there is something within that process that changes and something that stays the same, right? What stays the same is the action in the narrow sense of, the physical event that I made, that I caused in the world. But there are sort of different sort of value variations, we could say, right? So there are certain values that I first thought that were connected with the action, and that the action would embody certain values, and then I realized it doesn't, or etc., etc. So.
Giuseppina, did you have a question?
Yeah.
There's.
Okay, I'll keep it brief.
Yeah, we don't have long yet, so.
Okay.
For me,
so
we can also eat a bit into the next section.
Okay.
I can keep the reading.
Or we can start the next session.
we can start with the-
If necessary, yeah, why not? We have
Yeah,
time.
why not?
So.
So how does this account, which is clearly non-reductivist, or tries to be non-reductive and non-naturalistic, in sort of the kind of I suppose non-reductivist move that you get in sort of analytic philosophy of action, where people say, look, yes, so actions cannot be described causally, so there is a rejection of the causal theory of action. But on the other hand, where they would go is to say something, you describe something as an action when you describe it somewhat teleologically, when you understand it in relationship to its purpose.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems, obviously, in some sense, there's something in common, because when you understand something as having a purpose, then, in a sense, you understand, you see it as imbued this with meaning. That is what that person was trying to do.
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it seems to be quite different from what you're doing, because there isn't that split between the first bit and the second bit, yeah?
Yeah.
As Ascombe was saying, what is the man doing? Is he moving the pump? I can't remember the example very well.
The turn spit? No.
The pump. The pump. Is he turning the pump, or is he poisoning the inhabitants of the household? I can't remember. So in that sense, action, as she says, is intentional under a description, and you could say that what your little man was doing was scoring a goal. Depending on what the goal that you ascribe to your little man, then there is a different action which is not limited to one. So if you're saying his intention was to score a goal, then the action is the whole thing. It's not just the voluntary movement of stretching the leg.
Absolutely, yes. No, that Husserl would agree upon, but he would say that, so absolutely, so I agree, this whole thing is an action, and this whole thing deserves to be called voluntary, right? But Husserl wants to say there is one segment, and by the way, this is a composite action. He believes that not necessarily all actions are composite. You could have simple actions where you don't necessarily have this kind of clearly demarcated, segment 1, segment 2 structure. But here would say, sure, the action is I'm trying to score a goal. I'm not trying to kick the ball. I'm trying to score a goal. Because if I'm just trying to kick the ball, it doesn't matter where it goes, right? Whereas here, I'm trying to score a goal. But he would say, when we say this whole thing is an action, and this whole thing is voluntary, right? We have to distinguish between a part, a segment of the action that carries the property of voluntariness in the eminent sense. So we could say that, this is where the property of voluntariness spreads from, and a part of the action that is only deserves to be called voluntary because it inherits the voluntariness from the first segment. That's the view. So the view is that there is a distinctively kind of natural physical part or component of an action, but that can only be called voluntary and can be part of the whole action because there is one part of the action that's not itself experienced as the effect of a cause. So it's not a matter of only calling this voluntary or calling the whole thing. You call the whole thing, but the component, that kind of in which the property of being an action and being voluntary originates can be more specifically located here. That's the thesis. I don't know if that makes sense.
I'll stop. So
Stop here.
Yeah,
Jim, did you have a question?
Yeah, I don't know when is now good, or did you want to break, or what did you?
We have another 5 minutes, I think. So
Maybe we can do last question and then
Yeah,
a
then
few
we
more
can-
questions after the break. Is that fine?
Yeah.
Okay. Don't forget your questions, please.
Thanks very much. I really enjoyed that, and I don't work on Husserl yet. I found it very, very clear.
I like yet.
It's leading me to the promised land. So I like the comparison with the perceptual and the agency, and the kind of issues about preconceptual synthesis and pre-configured perception and so on, and then judgment and so on, predication. But I was thinking, I'm wondering about these paths that are there, and similarly, you can wonder about the same thing in the perceptual. What is the preconceptually configured?
Yes.
And of course, so you could say there's animals and infants, that there's a kind of animal cognition and animal agency that's part of our animal heritage, you could say, from no doubt from evolution, natural selection. There's a kind of animal purposiveness to our bodily movements, which is very rich.
Yep.
But then you might want to distinguish in the Kantian sort of broad tradition that sort of agency and cognition from rational agency and intentional agency.
Yep.
And so on. So in that respect, if you look at then Kant's sort of be deduction and concepts already being involved in sensory intuition for there to be any perception of an object and so on and so forth. And then you think of kind of, yet there are infants seeing the mother's face and so on, and then there's moving and knowing gravity and standing upright. But then there's playing a football, or think of all the things you did since you woke up, socks, shoes, scrambled eggs, forks, and so on, trains. Then that sort of seems to be more properly, as it were, human action and intentional action, probably speaking in that sense, if you're into that kind of tradition. And then that reaches very far down, so it becomes very hard to isolate. There is animal cognition and representation and agency, which is ours as well as animals, but you can say it's very difficult to isolate those paths that are not already saturated with spaces of possibility that come from being human and enculturated and so on.
Wonderful. No, this is a wonderful question, and I don't know if I do not.